This is the front universal joint for the rear wheel drive shaft of the 2004 Nissan Frontier with a 4x4 application. We're not going to replace this U-joint because it's still in good condition, but this is the replacement part, and from the look of the replacement part, our grease fitting is in the cap itself and not in the center section like the rear. The factory universal joint does not come with any greasable fitting, so it's not serviceable. This one is. It will most likely last longer than the factory one, so it's advisable that you get a greasable universal joint or a U-joint. In this video procedure, we're going to start by replacing a brand new U-joint, universal joint, into the Nissan Frontier drive shaft. This drive shaft belongs to the rear axle. We must first take a look at the pinion yoke, and we will notice our ring groove, which will require some cleaning. You want to make sure the groove is clean because when we install the C-clip, it will be seated properly into the groove. Now for the assembly process, we want to make sure we spread a nice clean towel and we're going to have to take our joint apart. Now that we have the old part removed, inside the drive shaft and the U-joint cap itself here is where the ring gear would seat. So we want to make sure we clean it out with a screwdriver or a pointy tool. So this way we know our C-clamp is going to seat perfectly during replacement. We're first going to remove the cap, and inside the cap we have some needle roller bearing. You want to make sure all the needle roller bearing is in position and you do not have a space between any of them. We also have a rubber seal for water and dirt. Normally a universal joint is put together like this. This universal joint has a greasable fitting, and we're replacing this universal joint at the rear of the drive shaft where it couples itself to the rear axle housing. The reason we're using this type of universal or U-joint is because since the drive shaft, this portion of the drive shaft rides at the lowest point of the car or the vehicle, chances are water and dirt will have the tendency to enter into the bearing as time progresses. The grease fitting helps us because we're able to pump grease into the part and remove all its water and dirt inside by packing it with new grease through the grease fitting. And we just want to fit the cap snug by hand, and then we're going to move it back and forth to make sure we have some sort of an alignment. We're first going to start this installation by removing the needle roller bearing cap. Inside the needle roller bearing cap we will notice little rollers. These rollers must have no space between them, and we must also be careful when we're installing it that it does not fall out of place, because this center section can crush the roller and break it. So we must be very careful. One way to prevent the needle rollers from coming out of position is to apply extra grease inside of the cap itself. This grease acts like a glue and keeps the roller in place. It is highly advisable that you use a press when installing the cap, but since we don't have a press, we're going to do it the old school method way. So what we want to do, we're going to seat our cap into the drive shaft yoke. Then we're going to install the center section to secure the needle roller bearing. Now we must hold this in place and just lightly tap into the position. And we're going to place the reverse side in. Once we place the reverse side in, we want to make sure we move it back and forth so we know we have a straight alignment. Now we're going to install the opposite cap. So the goal here is to achieve installing the cap below the ring seated groove. We will take our new retainer clip, place it on a flat surface, take the vice grip that we used to remove the old one, making sure that you don't change the setting, and we will clip the old ones. Simply place it in there and unlock it, making sure that it falls in the groove. Then we'll flip it over to the other side. We will drive the opposite cap below the ring seat. You must make sure that the retainer clip is properly seated in the groove. It's very important. Now you will want to move the U-joint back and forth, making sure that it's free. On the pinion gear yoke, we're going to install the cap like this. So you must look at the way I'm installing it first. I'm going to put this side in, and we're going to swing it around and slide the cap right into position. Now, when you're hammering, you want to make sure you hold the U-joint up into the cap. So we have the cap surfaced with the yoke. Now we're going to flip it over. Another thing is, every time you're hammering, you want to make sure that it seats perfect. This area here, if it does not seat perfect, that means one of the needle roller bearing came out of its location and is causing the cap not to seat. So when you're doing your installation, always make sure your cap seats fully to the U-joint center section. Now once you got that in, you're going to slide the yoke back and forth to make sure you have a center and you're not disrupting the needle bearing inside the cup. So sometimes if the cap doesn't seat perfectly and you have the ring installed and it's just in there, you just take the socket, place it on the ring, and you drive it. And eventually it will lock itself in place. Now you must be able to move all all the components smoothly. You should feel no grinding and moving these components around. If you do feel a grinding or some resistance, chances are the needle roller bearing came out of its location and is disrupting the movement. So the final inspection of the drive shaft is you want to make sure the seal and the cup is perfectly seated. You also want to make sure you don't damage the seal, and you should have a nice smooth movement in the joint. You should not feel any grind, or it should not be restricted. Always remember to check the seat. That will be this area right here. You want to make sure it's seated perfectly, and that will be at all of them. And this has concluded our installation of the drive shaft. And as you can see, I basically use 2 blocks of wood to place the tube of the drive shaft on. This way it doesn't get dent or deform, because any deformation in the tube will cause a vibration in the drive line and it will affect your bearing and seal. So be careful not to hammer the drive shaft or bang it against the concrete ground, and always protect the end that's laying on the concrete right there. So I didn't use a vise on this application. So now we have the drive shaft set up under the vehicle, and the next thing we must do before we can install this drive shaft into the transmission is we must apply some lube to the yoke assembly here. This is going to prevent damaging of the seal, and it's also going to ease our installation